Today we're doing the greatest top 10 comic book artists, and that's a huge field going all the way from the 1930s to now. It's going to be difficult to really get a list that I think a lot of people would agree with, even because it's such a passionate hobby that people might feel like their personal artist, their favorite artist should be on there. That's not exactly what we did. We went with the most important artists that we know from our collecting histories, which is diverse. Danny and I like different things, and he's way more experienced than I am because he's just been nonstop collecting for over 40 years. So we know that you're not going to agree with every name. We'd be really happy if you dropped in the comments artists you think we should add, or maybe some you think didn't deserve it.
I would say this, that while there's going to be people who disagree with us placing or leaving out somebody in the top 10, I don't think anybody would disagree that all the artists we're going to name are really important and influential artists in our hobby.
And a lot of this you're going to find stops at the year 2000 in terms of when these artists started. Some of them are still active now. So it's a pretty wide list.
Number 10.
Coming in at number 10 is Todd McFarland. So he made the top 10, and we'll just talk about Hulk 340 in 1988. This cover is well sought today. I sell comics for a living, and I will tell you I will never have a problem selling any grade copy of this book, and there's going to be multiple people that want to buy it immediately. That's a book that has a lasting effect.
You want to know something funny, though, about that book? I missed it when it was brand new, right? But it immediately became a hit.
Okay.
And I went and sought out a back issue copy of it within its first year of being out.
Right.
And I remember having to pay a premium already, for a book that had a 75-cent cover price.
What'd you pay?
Probably $5. But I mean, that's how fast its impact was. It was immediately popular.
And he had so many other covers, and we'll show some. He was in Detective Comics. He did Infinity Inc., which I really like those covers. We'll show a couple of those. This was the crescendo of it, but there was other covers in this little run in Hulk that are really well sought after today. And this wasn't even his most known work. I mean, as he went into Spider-Man, he blew up the character of Spider-Man, took him out of the black costume, and brought back the Spider-Man of his childhood and ours, in the blue and red and black. And you know what? It was an incredible run that he did an Amazing Spider-Man. Then he did his own Spider-Man series, eventually going to his own title, beginning with Spawn #1, which is a very popular book to this day. And there are a lot of printed copies of that book out there. And I also never have a problem selling a copy of that book. People want a copy of one of the best drawn covers. I really like the way he laid that cover out. And my friend from Bedrock Comics, Richard, he thinks that's one of the best comic covers ever drawn. And I can't really argue with him that Todd McFarland knows how to fire on all pistons when it comes to comic book art.
Isn't ASM 300 one of the most iconic covers of the Copper Age period?
It's interesting. I think that between Hulk 340 and Amazing Spider-Man 300, those two books have probably been swiped more than any two books. What I mean by swipe is other artists have taken that design, I'll go back to the Hulk 340, the design of the blades reflecting Hulk attacking Wolverine, and then in the cover of Amazing Spider-Man 300 with Spider-Man flying through the air, looks like he's going 100 miles an hour and his feet are in the air, and it's just an iconic pose for Spider-Man. And you'll see over and over and over again, he's a major artist to this day. And there's some more books. He just continues to draw great art, and he's very active in the community, not to mention his toy line, and not to mention he's done a couple of album covers. I'll show one, Follow the Leader by Korn. When this album came out, very popular album, and I remember buying the CD saying, Todd McFarland art? That's awesome. Anyway, let's go to the next one.
Number 9.
And we discussed this a lot, but we came up with John Byrne.
Yep.
It's just a coincidence, I think, as far as Todd McFarland and John Byrne being right next to each other, and they're also the two newest artists that are on our list. I just could not, when we were having this debate, I could not in good conscience leave him off the list. He was so impactful in the late 70s with X-Men. I mean, John Byrne's X-Men are really the epitome of the new X-Men. Look at all the things he did afterwards. How many different titles did John Byrne go and redo the character, reboot him from Submariner, Alpha Flight, Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
sensational She-Hulk run he did.
Fantastic.
DC, like he rebooted Superman. He did Next Men. I mean, and I'm not.
He drew the very first variant coverage. You know that?
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
Is that the Man of Steel?
Man of Steel #1. They had multiple covers. That was the first time a comic had come out with multiple covers, and that was John Byrne.
I just don't think you can leave John Byrne off of a list about the greatest comic artists, especially if you're getting into the Copper Age and the Late Bronze Age, because he was so influential. And we're not even talking about his writing, because some of what made his art even better was the fact that his writing was so good.
I really appreciate the stuff he did with Terry Austin as his inker. Let's just talk about X-Men 141. It's one of my favorite covers of all time. I actually named my business after that story in that particular book. Future Past Vintage Collectibles comes from Days of Future Past.
Number 8.
Bernie Wrightson, it comes in at number 8. I think everyone is familiar with Bernie Wrightson, but if you only collect modern books, maybe you're not. If you're really exclusively into superheroes, could have missed the boat on Wrightson altogether, because that's really not what he's known for. So my introduction to Bernie Wrightson as I know him, besides Kong the Unconquered, which me and my brother both love these types of books, these little small DC runs, were the horror books he did a little bit before that, in House of Mystery. He's undoubtedly one of the most sought-after Bronze Age horror artists that there was. He passed away several years back, but he's been really touted by people as one of the greatest artists, period, that ever graced on comics. And one of the things my brother showed me that he has, I don't have a copy of it, are the Frankenstein black and white sketches that he did.
Yeah.
It's, what is that, a portfolio? Mm-hmm. And I've talked to artists that were really inspired by this work. In a discussion I had with Tim Vigil, he told me that was a huge inspiration, his Frankenstein portfolio work. I completely understood, because Wrightson's a very intricate artist, but he also uses light in a way, in shading that can make a scary cover a little bit scarier. And he has a way of making a face look terrified or gruesome, or a situation look foggy and muddy or crisp and clear. So he's just one of the artists that didn't do a lot of superhero stuff. He did some Batman stuff. He did in early detective comics, early for him in the 70s. I really admired. Some of the work kind of called it in. So later on in his career, he still did a lot of work, but he wasn't as sharp and keen as he had been earlier in the 70s. And I think that work, people are going to be talking about it 50 years from now.
People love his early 70s work. I think House of Mystery 179 was his first professional comic book.
Amazing cover, by the way.
And
that's an amazing
pretty
cover.
much, I know Neil Adams did a lot of great horror covers for DC. House of Secrets 92 is his iconic, most classic, most valuable piece of work. And while people don't necessarily talk about the Swamp Thing 1 through 10 as much, that work was fantastic. I mean, he did 10 issues, cover and interior art, and they're just absolutely beautiful. I
still think they're underappreciated, and they're not necessarily cheap, but the fact that he did it cover to cover, and his skill and that story and that character remains popular today, and I do think the Swamp Thing has a future.
Look at Swamp Thing #7 with that great Batman cover. Those books don't have word balloons in the cover. It's just pure art, and they're gorgeous. And you said they can be pricey, but quite honestly, they're very affordable books to buy in comparison to other things.
Yeah, they've recently experienced some heat. There's been a lot of attention put on Bronze Age horror books. And Bernie Wrightson is probably the most sought-after artist in that genre. So right now, the prices are probably higher. I don't know where they're going. They could go higher. I have no idea. I personally collect Bernie Wrightson's work, and he's an artist that I have a few signed books by him that are in my PC. As a comic seller, I only keep a few books, really, and some of those are signed by Bernie Wrightson, and I'm really proud to have those. Want to pass them on to my grandchildren when I go. That's number 8. I'll turn it over to Danny for number 7.
Number 7.
L.B. Cole. There are people who may feel that L.B. Cole should be higher on this list. There's going to be people who think he shouldn't be on the top 10.
There's going to be people that think, who is L.B. Cole?
Let's start with just Mask #1 as a cover to just look at, right? And he did so much stuff. L.B. Cole was running Star Comics and doing the covers for most of the output from Star Comics. And he did all these different genres, right? Like science fiction, horror, romance. His work is very popular for Golden Age collectors today. I mean, the bulk, if not all of his work, I think is pre-code. He's a collector for, Golden Age enthusiasts, but I don't know how you don't mention L.B. Cole in a list of the greatest comic book artists of all time.
Yeah, if you think he should have been ranked lower, you don't really understand why we're talking about L.B. Cole. We get it. You probably aren't familiar with his work. I can tell you I left collecting for 20 years. One of the first books my brother Danny showed me when I came back about 5 years ago was a copy of Mask #1. And I looked at this and I didn't know what to think of it. It was so outside of what I liked in the past. I was not familiar with this book in my former collecting. At first I didn't like it, and then I kept looking at it. It's just an amazing drawing, 1945, so we're talking World War II era cover. This is amazing, and the longer I'm around, the more I like his other work, because I'm a horror guy. I broke my teeth on Neil Adams and Bernie Wrightson, and some of the other artists that were doing horror, and this is a whole different level. So as you can see in all the covers that we're showing you by L.B. Cole, he did a lot of work, and he is heavily collected. People chase after his books. They get record amounts of money for what they are, and primarily non-superhero books.
Oh yeah, if he did any superhero stuff, it's not coming to me.
Primarily non-superhero. So L.B. Cole made number 7.
Number 6.
Number 6 is Wally Wood. Now, I got to tell you, I love Wally Wood, but my brother will talk to you about Wally Wood.
So again, when we were discussing this list, you said, did Wally Wood have a body of work big enough, really? And I think he did, because beyond the stuff that people would consider him for, whether it's they're familiar with him because of he's the guy who made Daredevil's red costume, and he did some early issues of Daredevil. Besides some of the work he did, like All-Star Comics number 58 with the first Power Girl in the 70s.
That was much later. Yeah.
Right. What I think of when I think of Wally Wood is his work at EC, predominantly. Incredible Science Fiction number 33 is an example of one of his best pieces of work. Incredible Science Fiction 33 is the very last EC comic book.
Okay.
Before they went to just all Mad magazine.
Right. Just look at this. You can see the intricate detail that Wally Wood put into this. The longer I look at his work, the more I like it. And it's so funny. All the people that respected him in his own day were the greatest artists alive at the time.
Our friend Ken, one of his favorite covers is Weird Science number 9. And it's that fantastic cover with the aliens looking at the U.S. Air Force jets coming through the porthole. And it's like...
It's so good.
You can go on and on, not only with his work at EC, but he did other stuff. He's just a fantastic artist. His 50s work, I think, was unbelievable. And then I found out later through some research, he was the highest paid comic artist through the mid-60s when he was doing interior work for Mad magazine. He eventually left Mad, went to Marvel, and that's where I think he started his gig on Daredevil and stuff.
I think Wally Wood was the first artist that ever drew Alfred E. Newman as Alfred E. Newman, right?
Probably. I mean...
But what's interesting, Danny and I did a little deep dig. One of the things we found is the very first appearance of Alfred E. Newman is in what?
The cover of Mad Comics number 21, which I believe the cover art's credited to Elder.
We're just going to show you this part of the image because we were both just cracking up. His first name was Idiot. Now, Alfred E. Newman, by the way, has been around for a long time, and it was actually a real person, and they ran some ads years before this. We're not going to get into all that, but it's fun. So if you ever have a chance, research that. Anyway, more about Wally Wood.
I just think he's a fantastic artist. His work spanned 50s, 60s, 70s. He died young. He died in 1981, so, we didn't see work past then, but like even the stuff he did in the 70s with DC, I liked. He's very prolific. He worked in the comics field for many years, but the work that he did at EC is beloved by people, and I think that alone makes him deserving of being on this list.
Totally agree. Before we get into the top 5, we're going to do some honorable mentions because it's almost impossible not to compile a list like this without looking at these other really impactful artists and almost making an argument for why they aren't on the top 10. And I can tell you it would have been probably easier to do a top 25, but we decided to whittle it down to 10 with some mentions.
We wanted to make a list that spanned the 80 plus years of comics and say, who do we think are the greatest comic artists of that entire period? But like, there's so many great artists.
Well, you have to look at like comic books predated rock and roll is essentially dead. And comic books are still around. So you've got this art form that is starting to really gain some longevity as it's kind of creeping up on 100 years as an art form. Because if you go into pulps were similar. They were very similar to comics, but they made them much more portable when they went to 10 cents and the general population.
In the 2030s, comics will be celebrating 100 years as an ongoing art form.
So it's just an amazing era that we're coming into, and we feel like this kind of content's important so people can have an idea about how impactful it was. Here's some honorable mentions.
Honorable mentions.
In no particular order. Harvey Kurtzman.
Harvey Kurtzman, he worked at EC2, and you know what, maybe before we just do a deep dive into Harvey Kurtzman, let's just say the whole EC bullpen.
That was on our list.
Deserves.
Every artist at EC Comics deserves an honorable mention, and they have their own fandom. It's kind of like the Star Wars of comic books. There are people that all they care about is EC. They had a bullpen of artists that are second to none. I'll have Danny talk about it a little.
Al Feldstein, George Evans. Kurtzman was the war guy. Two-Fisted Tales.
One of the best names, by the way, for a comic book, Two-Fisted Tales.
Well, yeah. But look at the cover of Mad Comic #1. That's a Kurtzman cover.
Really cool. Yeah, he had this elongated style that was unmistakably his. I could always tell Kurtzman art.
He was responsible for the creation of Mad Comics. The artist, writer, editor of the war books,
right?
Frontline Combat and Two-Fisted Tales. You can't not mention Harvey Kurtzman when you're talking about some of the great artists. Al Williamson. Oh my God, did I love Al Williamson's work in the science fiction books. It is so beautiful.
Intricate, detailed, realistic.
Just lush. It's just it's just lush and gorgeous. In addition, Graham Engles, he might be like the person who most influenced Writson's work, right?
If you ever look at Graham Engles, you're going to think, I didn't know Bernie Wrightson was drawn. I've always seen a connection between Frank Frazetta, Bernie Wrightson, and Graham Engles. They all have this style. There's always like saliva dripping on their teeth. But anyway.
All the EC artists deserve like an honorable mention.
Walt Kelly.
Neither you or I are like big Pogo fans, right? You can't mistake the fact that Walt Kelly was a hugely successful artist and very influential both in comic books and comic strips. Pogo was wildly successful. Animal Comics was by Walt Kelly. Pogo Possum by Walt Kelly. You know, he's an Eisner Award-winning artist. His stuff has been beloved by fans for many years.
John Romita.
The first cover that John Romita did in Spider-Man, ASM number 39, you know, that whole like Green Goblin unmasking Spider-Man and stuff. That's how he entered the Spider-Verse. Wow. Right?
And what's interesting, I'm going to show some of the romance books that he popped out of to get to Spider-Man, because as I discovered some of these covers, they're somewhat breathtaking to me. And I'm a romance fan from this era. Just to show, it wasn't like he found himself with Spider-Man. He was already doing some incredible work. And then Spider-Man gave him this vehicle or this catalyst to really help that character get to the next level.
Look at ASM 50, you know, the first Kingpin issue, and look at that cover. It's like his body of work at Marvel on superheroes is very good, very influential. Our friends, you know, whether it's Dr. Love or Ken Spencer and others that collect romance books, think very highly of his work doing romance. Books. So it's like John Romita needed to be mentioned on this list, I think.
Kurt Swan.
You did not think Kurt Swan.
We had a bit of a debate.
So when we were discussing different artists that should be considered as we're trying to develop a list of the greatest artists, I brought up Kurt Swan. You didn't feel like he really rose to the level of the other artists we were talking about, but it is really hard to underestimate the influence Curt Swan had at DC on the Superman family of titles.
Right.
From the mid to late 50s going all the way through the 60s, when every single Superman title outsold every Marvel title.
What do you think are his best covers?
I love that Superman 144
Right.
cover with the exploding Earth
Yep.
and Crypto. He just had a lot of great covers. Predating Neil, how Neil Adams did so many covers for DC where he didn't even do the interior work. They just started using them on covers.
Right.
Curt Swan was doing all of the Superman type covers. Not all of them. I mean, there was some other artists, that they also had, but like that Batman 121 with the first Mr. Freeze, that's a Curt Swan cover.
Yep.
So Action 232 is the first Superman cover of Curt Swan as doing Superman on a cover.
Right.
And from there, he kind of like became the artist doing Action, Superman. He was already doing Superboy. I know there's a lot of people who don't collect Silver Age Superman stuff, and they look at it and they think those titles are silly, but they were big sellers. And there's a lot of people who still love that work, and and when they think of Superman, to them, there's a lot of people who think Curt Swan is the man.
Matt Baker.
If anybody who didn't make the top 10, he would have been the one. And we kind of debated this, right? Like,
He's such a good artist.
who do we take off the list to make room for Matt Baker? Because, wow, when it comes to drawing beautiful women, Matt Baker, in the golden age, Matt Baker is the guy everybody thinks of, right? Whether it's his romance titles or Seven Seas, Phantom Lady, Teenage Romance 45. I know you have a copy of that. It's a very classic cover of his. He did so many books. If this list was the top 11, I think he would have been number 11.
George Perez.
The work that George Perez did, whether it was The Avengers, whether it was New Teen Titans, whether it was Wonder Woman, he was fantastic.
Crisis on Infinite Earths.
His Teen Titans books were really on par with how good the X-Men were. And if you're a Marvel collector and you love X-Men, but you never gave the Perez Teen Titans a look, it's a series that I think you would enjoy just as much because the stories and the art were fantastic.
Carl Barks.
Again, we don't collect this stuff, right?
Nope.
Carl Barks was the artist drawing.
Second funny animal artist.
Funny Animal was big.
Insane.
And Carl Barks was the duck artist. First Uncle Scrooge in 4-color, number 386. That's Carl Barks.
Iconic cover as well.
And that's not the first appearance of Uncle Scrooge. It's the first solo dedicated to him. He did a whole bunch of Donald Duck stuff in 4-color comics. Did Walt Disney's comics and stories. His work also, I'm going to use this word again, beloved by people who read this material when they were kids. Yeah, I think he definitely deserves to be in consideration here.
Jim Lee. And I'll talk about Jim Lee for a moment. I would have a hard time saying that he's not one of the greatest artists out there. And I think anyone who collects books in the last 20 years, and his career is longer than that because he did the X-Men covers on the relaunch of X-Men, the second series, and people just bought those up. He sold a lot of covers, and he ended up being one of the most sought-after artists at the time. But every time I see a Jim Lee cover, I sell comics for a living, so I see a Jim Lee cover, it stops me in my tracks. I can see his art from a mile away at this point. Really reminds me a lot of Neil Adams in terms of his realism and how good he is at drawing Batman. So there's a lot of things I like about Jim Lee, but he hit the list. Alex Ross. I'll let you talk about Alex Ross.
Kingdom Come.
That was a mini-series, right? Or was it
yes.
just...
Well, I think almost
a one-shot?
Everything he did was
small run.
Right. He has such a unique style to him. I don't love his work personally, but I know that his work is popular. And I know that there are books that he drew that are popular because he drew them.
He stands out. Even Rachel can recognize his art.
I bought Alex Ross stuff because usually they were on big projects that were wasn't there one called The Marvels or something like that?
Yeah, the Marvels with the acetate covers. Yeah.
So I bought these things new because there was so much buzz around them.
Right, and they're good. They're cool.
And they're good stories and the art's great. He definitely deserves to be discussed.
Frank Miller, if you're a modern collector and you're buying comic books right now, you're finding some Frank Miller covers. We're not talking about those.
Because they're not great.
They're different. I really think they're all self-portraits. I was telling Danny, it's like, that's Frank Miller. Frank Miller's drawing Frank Miller, not as Frank Miller was, but the way he looks right now.
You got to show that Wolverine cover.
And obviously you might know him from Daredevil. He did some incredible Daredevil stuff in the 80s.
Daredevil and Elektra. And I really think he came into like people's mind though with The Dark Knight Returns. Like that was...
And that was very different. But he was also in Sin City. He did some stuff in Dark Horse.
What's interesting about Frank Miller, and a couple of other people were mentioning, good writer too, right? He's one of those guys that not only was a great artist, but he was a really good writer, and some of the things that he's remembered for the most are the things where he was in complete charge of the project. Again, like The Dark Knight, right? Like, who was buying comic books when that came out and wasn't buying Dark Knight? We all were buying it. It was
so hot. It's not as hot now, and it's gone down in price a little bit after the comic boom of 2021, and then the prices kind of calmed back down. Last artist on our honorable mentions, which is longer than our actual top 10, Jim Steranko. By the way, Jim Steranko is always one of my favorite artists.
I think there's going to be people who watch this video and they're going to say Steranko should be in your top 10. It's like, who is doing work like Steranko? Like, Steranko designed the X-Men's logo. I think it was X-Men 50 or so that he replaced the old logo with the new logo that's still in use today.
That's right.
Steranko did, oh my God, the work he did on Nick Fury.
Nick Fury, amazing.
Oh my God.
Amazing covers. It's underrated, by the way, and it's not one of the most touted or popular series, but if you're a cover artist person and you've never seen these covers, they're worth taking a gander at.
Nick Fury number 6, you and I were talking about yesterday.
So incredible.
What a fantastic cover, right? Well, look at Captain America 110 with the Hulk on the cover.
And that is one of my all-time favorite covers of his because of the way that Bucky looks scared to death running around that wall, and Hulk just looks... kind of reminds me of a dog that doesn't think about anything, but the next moment he's getting ready to eat Bucky, you know? And Captain America even stopped in his tracks like, what is that?
Hulk Annual 1.
Hulk Annual 1. Now, that wasn't his face on the Hulk, but the whole design of it, that's all him. And that is a very sought-after book.
Wasn't it like Marie Severin or something?
It was Marie Severin that ended up having to go back and do the face because at the time, whoever the editor was thought that he made the face too ugly and he wanted to pretty up the Hulk a little bit. But anyway, it's one of my favorite covers.
We do have one more person, though, that's on the list. Yeah, Will Eisner.
Oh, how are we going to forget Will Eisner?
The guy that the Eisner Awards are named after. And we'll put up a copy of Spirit 22, probably one of his most iconic covers. But
so good.
Another artist that Golden Age collectors, he's beloved. His character, the Spirit, was wildly popular for
and reprinted. It's been regurgitated a few times, and with his art even.
Here's a guy that, like, every year at the San Diego Comic-Con, they have the Eisner Awards.
Right.
To recognize other artists. How do we not mention Will Eisner in a list that's discussing who we think are the greatest artists?
Hey, that was the bottom half of the top 10, plus the honorable mentions. Make sure to stay tuned for our next video, which is the top 5. Which artists are missing? Can you figure out who's the top 5? Drop it in the comments who you think it's going to be. See you next time.